Just one thing going forward, our next meeting is June the 25th here, which will be a fascinating talk on conservation. Now, probably Ian will tell you a bit more when he gets to that stage. So, thank you for listening to me, and I'll hand over to Ian.
So, thanks very much indeed. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. We're moving around the oratoric chessboard this year, having had 2 nights for our first two speakers, Stuart Edbeatty and Sir Terry Waite, and now Bishop Martin Seeley, who was my great pleasure to welcome. As well as being the recipient of an honorary doctorate from Berkeley Divinity School at Yale, Martin was recently, a year or so ago, awarded a supplement, and we're delighted that he's able to join us on what would otherwise have been a day at Sudbury show had he been still as our Episcopal Bishop. Martin's going to talk about trust and trustworthiness in public life. And one of the points that I was thinking about and reflecting on when I was planning this session this morning is a session that I brought before the Church of England Education Division some years ago, where we were coming up with some future scenarios for the way that education is going to be run by the Church. And we had labelled these scenarios with finitudes, like Hallelujah, see Jesus, Abide with me, and the Church as one foundation. And it was a reflection of the trust or distrust that existed between the education team and other parts of the Church. When we came back from one of the breaks, somebody had crossed out the Church as one foundation and written instead the Church's 2 foundations. And Martin will say more about the Church and other organisations in Israelites, I'm sure. If you join me about the Christian Martin Seeley.
Thank you, and thank you particularly for the honour of the invitation to give this annual lecture, annual Andrew Phillips Memorial Lecture. It was only a couple of days ago that Ian told me who the last lecturer was and the one before, so I'm feeling a little daunted. I'm delighted that it's brought me back to Suffolk out of the illusion called a retirement, and I'm grateful to my successor, as Bishop of Stephen Benedict, for giving a commission for me to appear in a public role in this beloved county. I met Andrew on many occasions and often was subject to his criticism of the Church of England and its hierarchical system, which he heartily disapproved. But it was a criticism which I appreciated as an appropriate counter to the subtle and not so subtle assumptions and practices which insinuate their ways into your soul so that you or I began to settle rather too comfortably into a role for which I was just a temporary tenant. I've taken, as Ian says, my title, Golding Trust and Trustworthiness in Public Life, a topic upon which Andrew would have much to say, and I regret that I started this piece of work too late to be able to learn from him. My interest or my engagement in this came out of a project that I led for the Church of England beginning in June 2020, so early in the pandemic, to realign the central operations of the National Church, so-called National Church institutions, the Church Commissioners, Lambeth Palace, Archbishop's Council, and so forth. The Education Department was one of, to create efficiencies and build a bit more of a common sense structure. I used to say that we achieved 80% of what we set out to achieve. I think on reflection as the time goes by, I think it's closer to about 60 or even 50%. But in the course of the work that we gathered data that show one of the main problems in the operation of the central institutions of the Church was a lack of trust, not just between the central elements and dioceses and parishes, but internally within these different sections of the national institution. One part, let's take a random example, Lambeth Palace, did not trust another, say, Church House, Westminster, so that Lambeth Palace will set up its own version of an activity, say youth ministry, which Lambeth Palace was meant to be addressing because of this lack of trust. As well as duplication caused by that sort of thinking, we also found a failure to join up on related areas of activity where they clearly belong together. So there was part of the work looking after church buildings that was held in church commissioners and another part held in church house, and the two did not engage well together. Through this project, we also gathered increasing evidence of what we already knew well, or I'd refer to, which is the distrust between one level of the operation and the other. So the distrust between the parishes in the diocese from the diocese and the national church. And all this pointed to a need for a piece of work on trust, and I was asked to set up in April 2022. And I invited Professor Dave Ford, retired Regius Professor of Divinity at Cambridge, and Professor Veronica Cope-Paley, who was then Dean of Business School in Bath, to join me as a core team. They've continued to work on this with extraordinary dedication in preparing what I believe to be the final report on the work in the General Senate in July this year. I retired as ENSF 15 months ago. I handed over the reins to the Bishop of Peterborough, who got me, asked me to stay on. We just say a word about Veronica, because she's been crucial in my learning about this. In our time with us working on this project, she retired from the University of Bath, only to be made the Dean of the Business School in Bristol. And since has retired from that, continues to be actively engaged in trust work in organisations nationally and globally. She's consulted for UN, for the BBC, for the Metropolitan Police, and countless commercial organisations. She's a faithful Anglican, worshipping a local village church in Somerset. She and Dave Ford have been amazing gifts to this project, given a huge amount of wisdom and expertise. Veronica's conducted 75 in-depth interviews with individuals across the church, which has provided a huge wealth of qualitative data for what has emerged as the main findings. Much of what I will say now has been informed or shaped by conversations and learning from Bryce. I discontinue this short narrative of my work with the church, but immediately realised that what began initially as a project looking at internal organisational trust issues, issues around governance, around behaviour, around responsibility and accountability, soon became engaged in the intensification of those issues through appalling failures around safeguarding, and then the church's handling of matters of sexuality, and then its response to the natural challenges and numerical decline. And just say a word about the safeguarding breaches of trust. These, like other major breaches of trust in an organisation, have two dimensions. First, the breach itself, the person who has perpetrated abuse, and then the breaches of trust by the organisation, by their failure to respond appropriately to those breaches. And this twofold dimension, so the wrongdoing and then the failure to address it properly, we can see in many areas of our life in terms of the breakdown of trust. The wrongdoing in the first place, failure to address the wrong properly. Both of those contributing to a major loss of trust in any organisation. Needless to say, this work has heightened my attention to trust issues, both trust and trustworthiness, in a range of organisations and institutions and in society in general, and one might both contexts, but this is the Church of England. I want to speak more widely than that and to raise questions, explore some responses about what this means in our society today. You deal briefly with some terms. What do we mean by trust in the first place? The Oxford English Dictionary defines it as a firm belief in the reliability, truth, ability, or strength of someone or something. It's not that helpful. Perhaps more helpfully, the American organizational scientist Elise Russo defines it as the intention to accept vulnerability based upon positive expectations of the intentions or behaviors of another, quite complicated, but the important points in that definition are that it highlights that trust involves taking a risk, taking a leap of faith. That's the vulnerability part in her definition. And secondly, that you take that risk because you believe the person you are going to trust has your best interests at heart. That's the positive expectation part. Those two pieces are crucial. So trust is not needed in conditions of certainty. We don't really say we trust that the sun will come up, nor that the kettle will boil if we turn it on and the fuse doesn't blow. We move into conditions akin to that sort of certainty in some of our relationships, that a friend is always on time. You trust them to be on time. We don't need to trust because they are on time. Or someone is always kind, so that when they are late or they are unkind, we know that conditions have changed and we need to understand why. Trust is vital when we do not know for sure what will happen, when we do not have enough experience to rely on a something or someone to a point of certainty, when we do not understand what's going on or how something actually works socially or mechanically. That means that trust is vital in times of change, in times of uncertainty and in times of risk. So Veronica wrote in one of our reports, in those situations, high trust in a leader or an organization will ensure that people will step out of their notoriety and embrace the new without having a guarantee of any outcome. So in state conditions of uncertainty, you will trust someone to lead you through change. But trust is necessary in order to allow that person to lead you through it. It also means that people in a whole range of arenas present themselves as trustworthy in uncertain times. Lots of people present themselves as trustworthy. Please take a risk with me because I have your best interests at heart, when in fact they're utterly good. Scholars, con artists thrive in times of uncertainty, ranging from politicians to advertisers to fishing emailers. And there are a few clergy in there too. And we can see that trust is vital in times of uncertainty, and we're clearly in such times today, more than I can recall in my lifetime. The trust is also intrinsic to ordinary life in more stable times, simply because you don't understand how everything works. We can't check on everything at every step, so we need to trust individuals and institutions in a host of roles that our good and the good of others is upheld. Trust, therefore, is the foundation of our daily lives and any institution and organization. We can recall serious breaches in recent times that have eroded public trust. Professor Nora O'Neill, who gave the very significant lectures in 2002 on trust, has commented more recently that the longer-term impact of these major breaches may well be to make all of us less trusting in one another. It's worth perfecting whether we actually feel we are less trusting now than we were, say, 20 or 30 years ago. In the UK, trust was significantly undermined by the behaviour of many financial institutions and their leaders in the build-up to the global financial crisis in 2008. Since then, a succession of high-profile scandals within other major national institutions, including, for example, the Metropolitan Police, have further eroded our society's capacity to trust. And trust is very hard to build up, but it disappears in a flash. One of the adages that stayed with me from the first time I heard Veronica use it, it's easy to be proven over and over again, is Dutch horror. Trust arrives on foot and flees on horseback. Following the global pandemic, if I may quote from Veronica again from our 2024 General Assembly report, society, she wrote, is becoming increasingly polarized and unpredictable, exacerbated by economic disparities between the wealthy and the poor, by geopolitical threats, of the escalation of war, and by other existential crises like climate change and the intimidating speed of technological advancements such as AI. People see a future that looks uncertain, and that seems to be unfurling beyond their control. She continues, all of this has affected our disposition to trust, not just in the future, but in one another. Being let down in the past by others, individuals or institutions, coupled with uncertainty about the future, produces a filter in our mind's eye which affects our willingness to take a leap of faith and trust one another. Veronica's written that a decline in trust in national and global institutions is a global phenomenon. It's not just us, not just the church. Richard Eagleman, who founded the Global Trust Barometer 25 years ago, wrote in January 2025 that the 5 world-shaping events we can trust in our institutions are: first, the promise of the world being on a trajectory to everlasting peace and prosperity in the history argument, a trajectory broken by the outbreak of war in the Gulf in the 90s and the 2000s. The second chapter Eagleman identifies is the global financial crisis I've already referred to, 2008. The third is the rise of populism. The fourth, the global pandemic. And the fifth, the return of geopolitical insecurity and consequent posturing by militarized powers. Eagleman also reports amongst populations the rise of grievance. Currently in the United States, trust in the national government had declined from 73% in 1958 to 24% in 2021, depressing where it is now. Western Europe seen a similar steady decline in public trust since the 1970s. But there's another dynamic going on here as well as the decline in trust, because life seems so uncertain, so unpredictable. We can find ourselves, rather than trusting too little, trusting too much. We do trust the advertiser or the scammer or the politician against the odds, because we need to feel that something might work. And in institutions and organizations, too much trust can develop through insufficient questioning or checks, through a fear of the consequences of whistleblowing, and through an operational machine that is too difficult to challenge or change course. We can think of the failure to spot what Harold Shipman was doing, even though the data was there, or what Nick Beeson was doing in Barrient's Bank, or the failure by Cora Reynolds and the Post Office colleagues to trust their own staff and what they were saying in the midst of the Horizon IT scandal. The infected blood scandal is another appalling and deadly example of people trusting too much when the evidence was clearly to the contrary. And then, as I think we can see in all these examples, that double breach of the wrong itself and then the failure to address it, even involving deliberate cover-up. The collusion to be silent in these situations, whether in our own behaviour or in institutions and organisations, been labelled by Barbara Heffernan and other path academic as willful blindness. Let me add one more contextual element to this picture, which is the role of social media. In the work we've done in the Church of England, social media has played a significant part, it seems, in the erosion of trust, particularly between different parties or theological bowls, if you like, in the Church of England, where views are not only widely disseminated through social media, but are reinforced through social media algorithms and the like-minded social media groups, WhatsApp groups, and so forth. It's worth reminding ourselves just how recently this has become part of our lives. Facebook started in 2004. Twitter started in 2006. Dare I say, if we think things have got worse in the last 20 years, we may not have to look far to find out at least part of the reason why. The amount of time we will spend online, or wide prevalence of social media in our work and personal lives, has clearly shifted how we relate to each other. The internet and social media give us the illusion of having access to reliable information. Digital technologies support voluminous, remote, and often anonymous dissemination of material whose trustworthiness or untrustworthiness is hard to judge, says Honora Benito. We are increasingly lax in our amplification, in our pace and tone of judgment on our individual leaders, or others indeed. And at the same time, paradoxically, we're becoming lax in our scrutiny of whether the informational source we're accessing to underpin those judgments is accurate or reliable. People just accept what they first read and are in danger of failing to seek out counter-arguments on the web. It's like informing yourself solely on headlines, and so becoming less, not more, informed. In some exchanges, we are insufficiently rigorous in tracking the identity of the source itself or questioning the source's motives. We delude ourselves into thinking we are more informed because of the ease of access to volumes of information. However, through our indiscriminate use of social media, we're in danger of becoming stupid in our doctrines of where to place our trust. I came off all social media, except WhatsApp, last October, in part as a promise to myself that I would do this when I retired, realizing quite a lot of time I was spending away. I can't say I've missed it. And I see you did become aware just how much time it was taking. Dangerously, I had to admit, I've just gone back to Instagram in order to keep up for my children. In all of this then, the key question becomes how we judge whether a person or an institution can be trusted. Honora O'Neill again tells us what matters most is being able to judge trustworthiness and lack of trustworthiness. To start to look at this, I want to draw first on the work of three scholars, Mayer, Davies and Shulman. You don't need to remember that, but those are the three who are responsible for this, who've created what's become the most widely accepted definition of the key ingredients of trust. They published their trustworthiness model in 1995, and it has stood the test of time. They identified three main ingredients of trustworthiness. First, ability or competence. Is the person or the organization capable of doing their job and fulfilling their purpose? Secondly, benevolence. Are the individual or organization's actions self-centered for their own purposes, or are they there for the concern of others? Thirdly, integrity. Is there a moral code underpinning their actions? And is that code acceptable to others? Do we agree with it? Fourth dimension, they added slightly later, is predictability. Our ability, benevolence, and integrity demonstrated on such a consistent basis that they become predictable to us. Ability, benevolence, integrity, and predictability. We trust the Red Cross because they have the capacity, the capability to relieve suffering and uphold human dignity in areas of human conflict, because they are committed to the care of others. Benevolence is their core purpose, and that resonates with most people's desire for our work. They have a moral code, so integrity, that underpins their work, and they have delivered consistently since their founding in 1863, so they are predictive. You could do the same exercise with individuals in public life, as well as other institutions, since we're thinking, what are the institutions that you trust? And are those four ingredients there? I think you'll find them there. It's helpful to notice that two of those four are more forgivable than the other two. We could forgive, unfortunately we do forgive, lapses in capability. where we just get something wrong that we usually get right, or where we find ourselves having extended beyond our capability and not manage again. Training, having another go, developing new systems can address failures of capability and fairly quickly restore trust. Lapses in predictability can also be forgiven. A friend who is never late is late, and we discover why, and we understand and we forgive. But lapses in benevolence and integrity are much harder to forgive. They are much more serious. And the serious breaches that I've mentioned within the church and the other institutions I refer to are lapses of benevolence and integrity. These are lapses in living out to the values that others identify with the institution. That becomes seen as a flaw in the essential character of the organization, thus rendering it trustworthy, untrustworthy. No institution, whether it be the monarchy, the NHS, the police, the universities, national charities, can now assume that they are entitled to expect the trust of the public just because the mission of their institution is good or stated as good. Wearing a dog collar or running a national charity does not now guarantee institutional trust or respect unless an individual working within that institution is personally known to be trustworthy. Interpersonal trust to remain strong while the institutional trust is in decline. Eagleman, the man in the barometer, also notes that trust in the leaders, local leaders, is more robust now than in national and international figureheads. So we pick up that point. There is something about the importance of knowing a leader or believing that you know a leader in order to trust. People trust people, and ensuring that knowability exists as a possibility is part of the responsibility of a leader at any level. I'm struck by, as I was coming here, the estate agent signs have got the estate agent's picture on them. And that's part of how do you trust this estate agent? Because you present yourself as a knowable person. Because my friend told someone that estate agent Paul. One of the people I spoke to in the early stages of this project is Dave Barbara Woodward, then serving as the UK ambassador and representative to the UN, which is now the UK's deputy national security advisor responsible for international affairs. Of course, the reason I'd let him speak to her easily, and she was readily open to a conversation over a tea in her office in New York, is that she is from Suffolk, or Gipping, and Suffolk is a refugee indeed. It was actually a refugee part of the pandemic. I met her in New York in April 2022 when she was chairing the Security Council a couple of months after Russia had invaded Ukraine. I asked her how in her world trust is built. She told me in two ways that are fundamental to her work. First, picks up on the knowing people in order to trust them, or to know them, to know how much you can trust them. So she would make a point of meeting every new ambassador to the UN, so that in any situation, with any issue, she had established a connection with the person she was talking to or engaging with. That staying is a key element in building trust, in establishing trustworthiness. The second factor, she said, in building trust was that the UN nations had a set of rules by which they lived and conducted their business and their international relations. Personal connection and shared rules meant that they could establish a basis of operational trust. That was, of course, until Russia invaded Ukraine, breaking the rules. And that's been in the world in which international relations have been conducted ever since, exacerbated and deepened by the activities of the current US administration. In a subsequent exchange with members of Barbara Woodward's team, which she dictate access to. They wanted to add to that list, the list of 4 that I gave you earlier. They wanted to add impartiality and representativeness. This was later in 2022, and they indicated that, from their point of view, university institutions perceived as impartial, such as the UN or the World Health Organization, generally receive high levels of trust across the world. So impartiality contributed to trustworthiness. Although they pointed out the failure capability, can significantly damage trust even if impartiality is maintained. So they gave an example of the long saga of ineffective peacekeeping in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I think it'd be interesting to see where impartiality sits now as a condition of trust in these organizations, given the way in which, thanks largely to the US administration and others, identifying their side, i.e. being very partial, has become increasingly politically acceptable. In terms of what is trusted, Barbara Woodward's colleagues also observe, and I quote from them, monarchies across the world are associated with higher levels of trust. For example, during the Arab Spring, the countries that experienced internal destabilization, including popular revolts, were all non-monarchies. From Jordan to the Gulf monarchies proved the most resilient. They went on to observe, quoting, across the world, militaries generally, interestingly, are well trusted by their own populations. This can perhaps be explained by benevolence. Army protects them, capability and reliability. But we know through revolutions against military dictatorships, e.g. in Libya, that once the military loses its political impartiality, its popularity and trust levels can wane. Third, from Dave Barber's colleagues, this observation which feels even more relevant today. The collapse in trust in Western governments and the rise in populism may partly be a consequence, they say, of the breakdown of the economic bargain between the elites and the government. Rampant inequality since deindustrialization, the 2000 financial crisis again, and then anemic economic growth have contributed to this. They continue. However, the economic policies of populism arguably haven't delivered material economic gains for its voters, e.g., grinding poverty in the US red states. Why then the appeal of populism? One theory, they're saying, I'm reading, one theory is representativeness. US rural voters vote against their apparent economic interests for the Republican Party because they see it as representing their values, religion, tradition, family. And they see the Democrats as not representing them. So either coastal elites and so forth. Similarly, values, belonging, and identity were a critical component for the faith voters, the faith that voters faced in Brexit. That's the end quote from the UN office. This is part of the benevolence factor. We make decisions about trust because we think this person back room is for us, is on our side. The problem, and we see this starkly in the US and in other partex, is that that sort of benevolence can end up being for one group, the in-group, as it were, us, people like us, and not for what we would call the common good. And part of the way that someone persuades us that they are benevolent towards us is to identify other people whom they resent as a threat to us, and thus also the seeds of horror. You get back to slight calm autism. One of the situations that can arise in a great kind of trust when between an organization and its members, or a company and its customers, or a political party, its electorate, or a church and its people, is what academics call strategic drift. This is the state when there is an increasing misalignment with the expectations of those who you serve, and a loss of confidence within the organization from your own people. So the institution has become misaligned with what people are expecting or hoping for. And internally, there's a loss of confidence, perhaps of waning faith amongst supporters, whether customers or users. This is called strategic drift. And the level of change needed eventually goes beyond the capability of the organization's normal adaptive systems. You can't manage this by business as usual. The typical response to strategic drift, to strategic drift, is to make things better, to implement a whole host of multiple initiatives, to try and say, this will fix it, do all these things, and this will fix it, rather than stepping back and saying something is seriously wrong. We need to realign. Let me give you Bishop Birek, I'd say to you, you're rather a take on church people in this respect. People outside the church largely associate, or used to associate, the church with what I would call pastoral care, whether through the formal expression at baptisms, weddings, funerals, or the informal expression through individuals being cared for and supported, or groups being cared for, historically in health and education, and currently through such means as through banks, children's programs, youth projects, and so forth. Interestingly, the two predominant responses of Suffolk clergy and laity to what they faced in the horrors and the pandemic was a realization that actually people didn't want to join in worship. Remember, could use church buildings, and everybody discovered they could do online. And then they discovered that all sorts of people were joining that you hadn't actually opened the doors of church before. And so there was suddenly a sort of sense of goodness. So this is important, so we need to be doing this. And the second thing was what Buckers called a renewal of the vocation of the church, to be out facing and caring for others, which of course people were doing in churches, but also a host of other community groups, as we discovered who our neighbours were, and we went out and made sure they got their shopping, and we made sure they had some contact and a conversation on the phone. All remember that, those very tricky days, and you did it through. In my experience, these safeguarding scandals, which have put trust in the wider institution under huge strain, has not necessarily had an impact, a negative impact, at the local level, where those serving, those being served, be face to face. People trust people. Somebody comes and trust them. This entails a positive response from the wider population, the greater level of trust, and sometimes populations. And yet, it's going back to my point about the response of an organization crisis is to proliferate initiatives. The National Church response is to promote a proliferation of initiatives to target growth first, as if that was an end in itself, bypassing the practicalities of LAB support and pastoral and practical care, which the wider society sees as the Church's core value, along with conducting worship, that even if you don't attend. Indeed, programs both concede simply as self-serving to outsiders. Church is experiencing strategic drift, having drifted away, I will argue, from its core societal purposes. The other response related to a loss of trust is to increase monitoring and regulation. Honora Neal, however, reminds us that there are limits to transparency, and that should not dent our willingness to trust. She says, trust is needed because all guarantees are incomplete. Trust cannot presuppose or require a watertight guarantee of valid performance, and trust cannot be withheld just because we lack guarantees. The more organizations increase investment in resources, time, systems, and people in checking for untrustworthy behavior, the more we signal, beware, people cannot be trusted. So the more scrutiny, regulation, and so forth goes into that, creates the impression that we're actually not trusting. Will Self, not known for his right-wing views, wrote an interesting piece in the Telegraph last week, touching on these themes. He was writing about Keir Starmer under the title, "Starmer isn't an aberration, he's the personification of modern Britain." In the piece he wrote, "The important thing about Starmer is not that he is uniquely unpleasant or uniquely managerial or uniquely hollow. The important thing is that he is the long historical result of a society that has proceduralized itself to the point where procedure no longer mediates trust, but replaces it. Starmer is not an aberration of contemporary Britain, as one of its purest expressions. This is why the altruistic of the good bloke matters. A good bloke is not simply a nice person. The good bloke belongs to an older and thicker social world. The good bloke being flawed, even corrupt, but he's legible. You know where he stands. His authority arises from its embeddedness." After yourself. So I've described a number of complex or challenging situations and pointed to or hinted at ways forward, ways to build and sustain trust, particularly public life. We conclude by just drawing some of those strands together. Picking up on oneself from here. People trust people, and they trust people they think they know, and because they think they know them, they think that they are benevolent, have their interests at heart. Leaders in any context need to recognize them, and then to be trustworthy, they have to be in some way accessible, knower, and evidently benevolent. And then they have to prove their integrity, their capability, and their predictability in being benevolent. We in turn cannot simply take them at face value, or what social media or appetizers or any other source may tell us, without interrogating the sources and checking the facts where one possibly can, particularly in the areas of benevolence and integrity. A flurry of increased activity, including increased scrutiny, is not the answer when an organization, including a public organization, has come adrift from its members, its supporters, and wider society. What is needed is a pause, a step back, overcoming denial, and listening to the people you exist to serve. A leader needs to enable supporters to feel reassured with a sense of continuity of the past, maintaining some of the familiar narratives while leading them into something new. So not throwing everything up in the air, but working out actually what has to change to enable continuing the mission into the future. The leader also has to have emotional intelligence and emotional accessibility for people to feel supported through the upheaval of change, whatever that change is, and continue beyond that to allow people the time to come to terms with that change. A crisis can force a pace of change that can't be sustained because people can't keep up or understand what's happening. So communication skills, emotional accessibility are crucial to lead people through. To quote from Veronica again in 2024, as a society, we've become increasingly judgmental, but at high trust environments, both readers and followers understand it is sometimes best to suspend judgment and to draw on empathy instead. When in person or remotely, the focus needs to be on building human relationships and vibrant communities, work environments, which people can disagree respectfully and still trust each other to do the right thing. At the end of this, public institutions and public life depend on trust in these uncertain times. In fact, I think the key is the quality of leadership. Leadership, it is emotionally alert, communicative, reflective, adaptable, determined, and relational, and not just in appearance, but genuinely so. The people who work closest to them would say the same about them that the people who follow at a distance would also be saying.
Martin, thank you so much. From the reactions that I hear, I think you struck many chords, so thank you. Your point about integrity took me back to a time when I was in the bank. I sometimes introduce myself by saying I was a banker when it was still a professional, which speaks, I think, to some of the lack of trust in that world these days. This was just after the Eastern episode that Martin referred to. And we were at a conference, and prior to the conference, we've been asked to identify a series of leadership qualities that we felt were important from a list. And when we got to the conference, integrity was one of the words. But of the 16 of us, only 2 of us had chosen integrity as being significant. Everybody else, when we started discussing it, said, well, it's tacit, isn't it, in what we do as bankers? And the point that the 2 of us made who chose it was to say that the danger is that it's tacit, it gets over to equal. I'm sure of a question, I know there's at least one, but Mark is indicating.